Another topic that we do need to again mention, and we'll mention this somewhat briefly, I think, is, and it's also tied to the economy, is the advancement of technology. We already made this point a long time ago that we are in the age of technology and rapid technological advance, and that process was speeding up faster than ever before. Existing technologies, say the airplane or the automobile or the telephone, were being constantly improved upon. The Wright brothers flew their airplane in 1903 down at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, managed to stay airborne for a couple hundred feet before they crash landed. Well, in 1927, Charles Lindbergh flew nonstop, well, obviously nonstop, over the Atlantic Ocean, a distance of over 3,000 miles from New York to Paris. That's revolutionary in a period of approximately 25 years. The automobile. The old Model T of 1910 is giving way by the 1920s to a whole new generation of automobile. Ford itself switched production over to a new car called the Model A. It was larger, more powerful, more reliable, more comfortable to drive, capable of greater speeds and so forth. The automobile was improving dramatically. The telephone, the old days where you had the one hand where you would hold the speaker and then you would hold the earpiece up to your ear with both hands, that's given way now to the universal receiver where you can speak with one hand, just as a small example here. Think also in terms of consumer technology. Washing machines, vacuum cleaners, an electric iron. These are things that are now affordable to the average consumer. And you now have electricity in your home. You can use these things, and it's becoming part of your life. So the technological advancements of the 1920s kind of fits into that long-term trajectory. How about the emergence of radio, commercial radio broadcasting? We mentioned how wireless telegraph had been invented in the 1890s. Well, now we're going to see where they can transmit sound over the airwaves. And the first commercial radio station began broadcasting in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in 1920. And within a couple of years, virtually every major city in the country has at least one radio station, in many cases more. By the middle of the 1920s, the medium-sized cities, the small cities, even some small towns begin to have radio broadcasts. And it's not just individual stations anymore. They very quickly figured out how to create radio networks. They very quickly discovered that using coaxial cable to connect radio stations, you could run the current of the sound through these cables. The end result is, with these radio networks, you could have, say, a sporting event being broadcast out of Yankee Stadium, say a baseball game, and you could be in San Francisco, California, listening to that game live in real time. Now, this is something that had never been possible before, and one of the important outcomes of this is that radio began to create a very common national cultural experience. We've experienced that much the same in our day with television and now with the internet, where you could be, in this day and age, you could be on the other side of the world, and you have the same access to the common culture that someone does on the other side of the planet. And this was now happening for the very first time. And radio stations carried the kind of programming that we are very familiar with. News events, sporting events, whether it's boxing, automobile racing, baseball. You could stage a reading of literature. You could do a play on the radio, symphony orchestras, jazz music, which was all the rage in the 1920s. All of these things could be broadcast over the airwaves, and they were. Soap operas that we see people watching on television today, soap operas began on the radio in this time period. So this new piece of technology was a very critical advancement for us culturally. Also, I think you might even be able to say that the radio had its own little spin-off effect. Period. And, it goes beyond radio. Another new technology was pioneered in the 1920s. Television was born. In 1928, I believe it was the first year when they actually showed that it was possible to transmit images. Now, this technology was not very good Images did not look like we would recognize them today. It was very grainy and so forth. But, you give it another 20 years, by the end of the 1940s, it is ready for commercial production. And by the 1950s, television was like the new radio as far as creating that national cultural experience. So the 1920s, again, fits right into that long-term trajectory of rapid technological advancement. Let's talk for a few minutes about the cultural shift in the country. Now, we don't want to say that this began in the 1920s, but it was accelerated, I think, by the war years, the anxiety, the stress of the war. People by the 1920s were becoming much more divided culturally than they might have had been before. There was talk in the 1920s of a thing called the new culture, which of course implies that there is an old culture. So we're going to have a kind of a conflict here between the new culture people and those who adhere to the traditional cultures. And I think, again, we see some of that today in our own time as well. The new culture, if we could talk about some of its defining characteristics, and again, I have these listed for you in the PowerPoint. People in the new culture tended to be more skeptical of traditional authority figures, whether those be political authority figures, religious authority figures. There was this idea that our authorities, if you will, had led us astray and made a mistake by getting us into the war and all the bad things that happened. And maybe we should be more assertive of thinking for ourselves and doing things our own way. So this higher level of skepticism. I think also that the people involved in the new culture are much more open to new ideas. They're much more experimental. They are not going to be stuck in patterns of past activity just because it was traditionally accepted. So they're very free thinking. Also, they are more secular in their mindset. Secular, of course, is the opposite of religion and religiousness. And we're not saying that they all became heathen atheists or whatever, but look, religion's day-to-day influence over the way people think, over the way people behave, was declining in favor of a more secular viewpoint. A greater appreciation or emphasis on material things. In this age of newfound prosperity, people began to take a greater obvious pleasure in obtaining the material things in life. Better clothes, perhaps a nicer apartment, nicer fancy furniture, the new car, things like that. And again, we experience this in our own time. So a greater emphasis on acquiring material things. Also, we said a few minutes ago that people on average had more leisure time than they had a generation earlier. And part of the new culture was to seize upon this leisure time to entertain yourself. Whether it's going to the cinema to see movies, whether it's going out to the jazz clubs, whatever it is, and sporting events and so forth, the entertainment and leisure culture was beginning to really take hold and grow. And again, that is something that we are quite familiar with, the entertainment and leisure culture. Who was it that was embracing the new culture? Well, just in a general pattern, I think we would be safe to say that people of the younger age demographics would be much more likely to embrace the new culture. No big surprise there. People who are younger have not had a chance to become set in their ways. The young mind is often, usually, very much more experimental and free-thinking than the older demographics. And so younger people, in a general sense, would be more likely to become part of the new culture or to embrace it than people of the older demographics. And another dividing point would be that if you lived in an urban area, say you lived in Chicago or New York City or another major city, you would be more likely to embrace the new culture and its patterns than people who live in small towns and rural areas. And I think we even see a little bit of that even today. But the new culture, not everyone embraced it. A lot of conflict over it, but the new culture was emerging clearly by the 1920s, and we might be able to make the case that that new culture today is the culture of our country. very quickly, one thing that we can mention about the conflict between traditionalists and the modernists, if you will, was the famous Scopes monkey trial in 1925. And this was a battle over the propriety of teaching Darwin's evolutionary theory in our schools. Traditionalists, predictably, did not like the idea of Darwin's theory being taught in our schools. They believed that it would undermine people's religious values and it would turn people into atheists and heathens, whereas people on the modernist side tended to believe, they're more open-minded, well, let's look at Darwin's theory and let's look at the scientific side of things as opposed to just the religious side. So maybe there's that secular mind there as well. So the culture was beginning to significantly shift in the 1920s along these lines.